Paris, February 1997. A woman swims laps in the heated pool at the Ritz. She is 76 years old, and she is the United States ambassador to France. And 30 minutes after she climbs out of that water, she will be dead of a brain hemorrhage on the marble floor of the hotel. Bill Clinton will send Air Force One to bring her home. Her funeral will be filled with senators, ex-presidents, and men who once loved her and never quite got over it. Here is what almost nobody in that funeral pew could explain, if you'd asked them directly. How did a minor English baron's daughter, with no fortune, no particular beauty by the standards of her own debutante season, and no career to speak of, end up buried at Arden, one of the great private estates of New York, married 3 times into 3 different American power dynasties, having outlived and outnegotiated every man who thought he owned her? She was born Pamela Digby in 1920, the daughter of a baron with a title and almost no money to go with it. That detail matters more than anything else in this story. English aristocracy in the 1920s was full of families exactly like the Digbys: old blood, old land, empty bank accounts, a house that cost more to heat than it was worth. Pamela grew up watching her family perform wealth it didn't have. She learned early that a good name and an empty vault can still open doors, provided you know which doors to knock on and which men are standing behind them. She was not, by her own later admission, a great beauty. Red hair, a round face, a figure her contemporaries described as sturdy rather than striking. What she had instead was attention, total, undivided, flattering attention, aimed at one man at a time like a searchlight. People who knew her across 6 decades kept using the same word to describe the effect. She made you feel like the only person in the room. Whether that was charm, strategy, or some fusion of the two, is a question this whole story keeps circling back to, and it never fully resolves. In 1939, at a London dinner party, she met Randolph Churchill. He was Winston Churchill's only son, loud, drunk, reckless, and convinced he was about to die in the war that had just started. He proposed to her within days of meeting her. She said yes within days of that. Neither of them was in love. Both of them were making a bet, hers on survival and status, his on leaving something behind before a German bullet found him. That marriage is where this story actually begins, and it does not go the way a fairy tale is supposed to. We'll get into exactly how the Churchill name became her first weapon, why the marriage collapsed inside 6 years, and how a wartime affair with a married 60-something American diplomat set the pattern for the rest of her life. A pattern she would repeat, refine, and eventually weaponize into 3 marriages, 1 ambassadorship, and a fortune measured in hundreds of millions. Before we go further, this is the real, researched version of her story, not the gossip column shorthand. Hit subscribe now, because the next section is where this story turns from a wartime wedding into something closer to a masterclass in reinvention. The Part 1. The Churchill Years. Randolph Churchill was a mess, and everyone around him knew it before Pamela did. He gambled money he didn't have. He drank past the point where charm curdles into cruelty. He was unfaithful within the first year of the marriage, and he was unfaithful for the rest of it. Winston Churchill liked Pamela. Clementine Churchill liked Pamela. The problem was never her relationship with the family. The problem was the man she'd married into it through. There's a story from early in the marriage that biographers keep returning to, because it tells you almost everything about how the household actually worked. Randolph came home from a card game, having lost an amount of money the young couple simply did not have. Pamela's response wasn't to fight about it. It was to go, quietly, to Winston Churchill himself, tell him what had happened, and ask him to cover it. He did. This became a pattern rather than a one-time rescue. Randolph gambled. Pamela managed the fallout, usually by going over his head to someone with deeper pockets and better judgment. She was learning, at 19 and 20 years old, the skill that would define the rest of her life: how to locate the person in any room who actually held the power, and how to become the one they wanted to protect. By 1940, London was being bombed nightly, and Randolph was rarely home even when he wasn't overseas. He preferred the company of his regiment, his card games, and eventually other women, to an infant son and a wife he'd married on a wartime whim. Pamela was left to manage a newborn through the Blitz largely alone, moving between her in-laws' homes and whatever shelter was available when the sirens went off. It's easy, looking back from a comfortable distance, to see only the calculation in what she did next. It's worth remembering, too, that she was 20 years old, functionally abandoned, with a baby, in a city that was being destroyed a little more every night. She got pregnant almost immediately. Their son, Winston, was born in October 1940, in the middle of the Blitz, while German bombs were falling on London. Mother and baby made the cover of Life magazine, a British propaganda image as much as a family photo, the young Churchill grandson, as a symbol that Britain would keep having children even while the city burned. Pamela understood, even then, the value of being photographed at the right moment next to the right name. That instinct never left her. The Life cover deserves a second look, because it's the first documented moment where Pamela actively shapes how the public sees her, rather than simply reacting to circumstances. The photograph wasn't an accident a magazine stumbled into. It was arranged, with the full cooperation of the Churchill family's press contacts, at a moment when the British government wanted exactly this image in American hands, proof that ordinary aristocratic families were carrying on, having children, refusing to be broken by German bombers. Pamela was 20 years old and she understood, immediately and completely, that she had just become a piece of wartime propaganda, and that being useful in that specific way bought her standing with people far more powerful than her own husband. It's the first time in the story you can see the pattern crystallize into something conscious rather than accidental. What the fairy tale version of this story skips is what happened next. Randolph shipped out. Pamela, 20 years old, was left in London with a baby, a famous surname, and almost no money of her own, because Randolph had already gambled through most of what either of them had. She needed a way to survive inside wartime London's social machinery, and the machinery she found ran through the American embassy. That's where she met Averell Harriman. Harriman was nearly 50, he was married. He was also one of the most powerful men in the Roosevelt administration, sent to London to run the Lend-Lease program that was keeping Britain armed and fed. He was rich in a way the Digbys had never been rich. American industrial money, railroads, banking, the kind of fortune that doesn't need a title attached to it because the balance sheet speaks for itself. Pamela and Harriman began an affair sometime in 1941. It was not hidden particularly well. Winston Churchill reportedly knew. Some historians argue he tolerated it, even encouraged it at a distance, because a young Englishwoman close to the man controlling America's wartime supply lines was not a bad asset for Britain to have. Whether that's true or an after-the-fact flattering read on a messy situation, the effect was the same either way. Pamela had learned that romantic access could double as political leverage, and political leverage could be traded for security. Think about what the affair actually gave both sides. Harriman got a well-connected, discreet companion in a foreign capital far from his wife in New York, at a moment when he was under enormous pressure to keep Lend-Lease running and Britain fed and armed. Pamela got access to a stream of information most cabinet ministers didn't have: shipping schedules, supply figures, the private mood of the American administration toward Churchill's government. She is widely believed to have passed pieces of that information back to British intelligence circles, not as a spy in any formal sense, but as exactly the kind of well-placed pillow talk that wartime London ran on. It wasn't glamorous, it was useful. And usefulness, more than romance, is the currency that kept showing up whenever Pamela needed to matter to a powerful man. The Churchill marriage didn't survive the war. She filed for divorce in December 1945, citing 3 years of desertion. Randolph had barely been present even when he was alive and in the country. She later converted to Catholicism and secured a formal annulment from the church, which meant that on paper, in the eyes of Rome, the marriage that had produced her only child had never legally existed at all. She walked away from the Churchill marriage with 2 things worth more than money: a surname that opened any door in London or Washington, and a son who carried Winston Churchill's name into the next generation. She would spend the rest of her life discovering exactly how far both could take her. Part 2. The Courtesan Years. This is the part of Pamela Harriman's life that later biographers argued about the hardest, and it's worth being direct about it instead of dancing around it the way a lot of retrospectives do. Between 1945 and 1959, Pamela Digby Churchill was, functionally, kept by a rotating set of extremely wealthy men in Paris, London, and occasionally New York. There is no polite word for it that isn't also an accurate one. Christopher Ogden's biography, and later Sally Bedell Smith's more exhaustive one, both use the phrase, and one obituary called her the century's greatest courtesan, without much apology attached to the label. The list of men in this period reads like a roll call of post-war European wealth. Prince Ali Khan, heir to one of the largest fortunes in the Islamic world. Gianni Agnelli, the Fiat heir who would go on to define Italian industrial power for a generation. Elie de Rothschild, of the banking dynasty. Stavros Niarchos, the Greek shipping magnate. American broadcaster Edward R. Murrow. Financier Jock Whitney. Each relationship followed roughly the same shape. Passionate at first, generously funded throughout, and structured so that when it ended, Pamela did not end up poorer than when it began. Apartments were furnished, jewelry was purchased, bills, in more than one documented case, were simply paid, quietly, by the men involved, sometimes for years after the affair itself had cooled. Agnelli's involvement with her is worth a moment on its own, because it shows how far this went beyond a fling. He was married, heir to one of Europe's great industrial fortunes, and by most accounts genuinely infatuated with her for a stretch of the early 1950s. He kept a car and driver at her disposal in Paris. He settled debts. When the affair eventually cooled, the arrangement didn't collapse overnight into resentment the way a normal breakup does. It faded, on terms that left Pamela's standard of living intact, and her reputation, within that particular circle, undamaged. Murrow was a different kind of relationship entirely, less about money and more about visibility. Being seen with one of American broadcasting's most respected figures did something for her social credibility in post-war Europe that no jewelry could buy. She collected men the way a careful investor collects a diversified portfolio, some for cash flow, some for prestige, rarely both from the same source, and never all her eggs in one man's basket at the same time. She wanted, several times, to convert one of these relationships into a fourth marriage before there was ever a third one. Rothschild in particular seems to have been a serious near miss. She reportedly gave him an ultimatum to leave his wife and marry her, and he refused. That refusal is the hinge the next 14 years turn on. If Rothschild had said yes, there's a real chance this is a story about a Rothschild wife instead of a Harriman one. There's a colder way to describe this period, and it's the one Pamela's own later friends sometimes used when they thought no journalist was listening. She was, in effect, running a small business with no employees and one product, herself, deployed full-time, to men who could afford the overhead, rent on a Paris apartment, a wardrobe suited to whichever social circle a current lover travelled in, jewelry that, unlike an apartment or a dress, could be sold later if a relationship ended badly. She was said to keep detailed track of what each man gave her, and what obligations, if any, came attached, an accountant's instinct wearing a debutante's smile. None of this made her unique for the era. European high society after the war was full of women doing versions of the same math. What made Pamela unusual was how well she played the long version of the game, refusing to let any single arrangement become the whole of her life, always keeping one eye on the next available exit. Instead, in 1959, she met Leland Hayward. Quick pause here, because this is exactly the point in her story where most people assume it's over, a courtesan running out of options as she nears 40. What actually happens next is the opposite, and it's the part most retellings get wrong or skip entirely. If you want the full, accurate version instead of the shorthand version, stay with this video, and if you're finding this useful, tap that like button now. It genuinely helps this channel keep making the deep dive version of these stories instead of the 5-minute clickbait cut. Watched her brother-in-law. The Hayward years. Legitimacy. At a price. Leland Hayward was a Broadway and Hollywood producer, the man behind South Pacific and, later, The Sound of Music. He was also, at the point he met Pamela, still married to his fourth wife, Slim Hawkes. Pamela did to that marriage roughly what she'd learned to do to every relationship standing between her and the next stage of her life. She moved in close, made herself indispensable, and waited. Haywood's divorce became final in 1960. The day it was finalized, Pamela married him in Carson City, Nevada. She became, by the count kept in his family, his fifth wife. It's worth sitting on that number for a second. Not his second, his fifth. Leland Haywood was a man who married often and easily, and Pamela had just outcompeted 4 other women, including the one he'd been married to for over a decade, for the position. This marriage moved her out of the drifting, transactional Paris years and into something with an actual social address. New York, Broadway, the entertainment industry's inner circle. It also moved her, for the first time, into a house that came with someone else's children already living in it. Haywood's daughter Brooke and son Bill did not, by most accounts, warm to their new stepmother quickly or completely. Brooke Haywood would later write her own memoir, Haywire, named after the family's Westchester County estate, and Pamela does not come off in it as a warm maternal figure. She comes off as a woman managing a household the way she managed everything else in her life, efficiently and with her own interests, never far from the center of the plan. There was also, underneath the surface comfort of the Haywood years, a genuine emotional cost that's easy to skip past when you're telling this story as a string of strategic wins. She had spent 2 decades being the desired one, the woman men competed for. In the Haywood household, for the first time she was competing against a grown stepdaughter's loyalty to her own mother and against a household staff and social circle that had spent years loyal to Slim Hawkes before her. Brooke Haywood's memoir describes a stepmother who redecorated rooms that held her predecessor's taste, who reorganized a family's rhythms around her own preferences within months of moving in. Read one way, that's simply what any new spouse does. Read another way, in the specific context of Pamela's pattern, it looks like someone erasing evidence of the woman she'd displaced as thoroughly and as fast as she could. Financially, the marriage worked exactly as designed. Haywood's income from the sound of music alone was enormous, and the Haywoods lived the kind of life the phrase lavish and luxurious was invented for. Manhattan and Westchester, a social calendar built around premieres and producers, a level of comfort Pamela had spent 15 years chasing through other men's bank accounts, and finally had attached to her own name, on paper, as a wife rather than a mistress. She also, for the first time, had to learn an American social register instead of a European one. The rules Pamela had spent 2 decades mastering in London and Paris, old titles, old land, whose grandfather knew whose grandfather, meant almost nothing on Broadway or in the Manhattan of the early 1960s. Money mattered more than lineage. Talent and box office numbers mattered more than either. She adapted the way she always adapted, by watching carefully, saying little until she understood the room, and then becoming exactly the hostess a particular circle of producers, directors, and studio executives wanted at their dinner table. Friends from this period describe a woman who had essentially re-engineered her entire personality once already for London high society and was quietly doing it again for New York show business, without most people around her noticing the machinery at work. It lasted until 1971, when Haywood died after a long illness. Pamela was widowed for the second time. The first marriage had ended in divorce. This one ended the harder way, with her nursing a dying man through his final months. She was 51 years old. On paper, this was the natural endpoint of an interesting but ultimately fading story. Aging socialite, 2 failed marriages, no fortune of her own to speak of, running out of decades to find a third act. 6 months later, she had one. The Part 4, the Harriman years, the old flame, and the long game. Averil Harriman's wife, Marie, died in 1970. Roughly a year later, some accounts say within months of both their spouses' deaths, Pamela reconnected with the man she'd had a wartime affair with, almost 30 years earlier. He was 80, she was 51. On September 27, 1971, she became Pamela Harriman, and for the first time in 3 marriages, she had actually married the man she'd originally started with. The affair that never quite died had simply been waiting out 2 other marriages and 2 other deaths to become permanent. Picture the actual mechanics of that reunion for a second, because they're colder than the romantic version usually lets on. Marie Harriman died in September 1970. Leland Hayward had died that March, 6 months before her. Pamela was, by the fall of 1970, a widow with no husband and a fading position in New York society, built entirely around a dead man's name. Averil Harriman was one of the few people in her address book who had both the fortune and the loneliness to make a fast second act possible. She did not wait years to test the waters. Friends of the family later described how quickly she inserted herself back into his life once Marie was gone, arranging visits, dinners, the kind of attentive presence that had worked on every man before him. Within a year, they were married. There is a version of this that reads as romantic, a love that survived 30 years, 2 marriages, a world war, and finally got its ending. There is another version, less flattering and probably closer to what actually happened, where an aging widow with no independent fortune identified the one man from her past, wealthy enough, connected enough, and now conveniently unmarried enough to secure the rest of her life, and moved on him within months of both their spouses dying. Her son later told a biographer that she'd always called Harriman the most beautiful man I've ever seen, which either supports the romance or supports how good she was at making a strategic choice sound like a love story. Both readings can be true at once. That's the uncomfortable thing about Pamela Harriman, that no clean narrative wants to sit with. What's not in dispute is what the marriage did for her. Averil Harriman had been governor of New York, an ambassador, a presidential advisor across multiple administrations, and one of the most connected men in the Democratic Party. Marrying him didn't just give Pamela money, though it gave her plenty of that. It gave her a party. She became, through him, a serious Democratic fundraiser and operator, founding a political action committee, originally called Democrats for the 80s, which she used to build relationships with a rising generation of party figures, relationships that would eventually connect her directly to a young Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton. This is the marriage where Pamela stops being simply a subject of other people's decisions and starts making her own. Averil was in his 80s for most of their marriage together, in declining health, and increasingly reliant on her to manage his public life. She took to the role the way she'd taken to every other role before it, studying it until she understood it completely, then running it as though she'd invented it. She learned policy positions well enough to hold her own at dinners with senators. She learned which young Democratic operatives were worth cultivating, years before anyone else in the party did the same math. Political consultants who worked with her in this period described someone who had gone from being managed by powerful men to managing a piece of the machine that produced them. Averil Harriman died in 1986, when Pamela was 66. He left her extraordinarily wealthy, control of trusts and assets built up over decades of Harriman family industrial and banking wealth. He also left behind 2 adult children from his previous marriage, who did not believe their father's 3rd wife deserved the level of control over that money that she ended up with. What followed was a bitter, drawn-out legal fight. Harriman's children accused Pamela of mismanaging the family trusts, spending down assets meant to pass to future generations, running through capital, rather than living off income the way the trusts were designed to work. The dispute dragged through the early 1990s and was eventually settled, with a substantial payment made from Pamela's estate back to the family trusts, an implicit admission that at least some of the mismanagement claims held up. She had won the marriage and the fortune it produced, and then spent years defending how she'd spent it. The lawsuit is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it complicates the tidy version of this story where Pamela simply wins every round. The Harriman family's argument, in plain terms, was that she had treated trusts designed to support multiple generations as though they were her own personal checking account, funding an ambassador-adjacent lifestyle of art, real estate, and political giving on capital that wasn't fully hers to spend. She fought the case hard and settled rather than let it go to a full public trial, which is its own kind of answer. $20 million, by most later reporting, moved from her estate back into the family trusts as part of that settlement. Not proof of guilt in a legal sense, but not nothing either. None of that stopped what came next. Part 5. The Ambassador. In 1993, Bill Clinton, the same Arkansas governor Pamela's fundraising network had helped build into a national Democratic figure, appointed her United States ambassador to France. This is the part of her story that the gold digger shorthand can't actually account for. A woman who had spent 5 decades being financially and socially dependent on a series of husbands and lovers, ended her life running an American embassy in Paris, a serious diplomatic posting handled with enough competence that even critics of her earlier decades generally credit her with doing the job well. The appointment wasn't a courtesy title handed out to a wealthy donor and left to run itself either. Colleagues at the embassy described her as unexpectedly hands-on, showing up early, reading briefing papers in detail, using the exact social instincts she'd spent 60 years sharpening on husbands and lovers to work French officials and American businesses into productive rooms together. The woman who'd once made herself indispensable to a wartime diplomat by making him feel like the only man in London was now doing something close to the same thing to entire trade delegations, and it worked about as well as it had the first time. She served from 1993 until her sudden death in February 1997. She had swum her regular laps at the Ritz, the same hotel where she'd once, decades earlier, lived on money that wasn't hers, funded by men whose names she'd needed and then outgrown. This time, the hotel pool belonged to an ambassador's routine, not a mistress's schedule. She collapsed shortly after getting out of the water and died of a brain hemorrhage. President Clinton sent Air Force One to bring her body home. She was buried at Arden, the Harriman family's historic estate in New York, on Valentine's Day, 1997, a detail no screenwriter would have dared invent, and yet it's exactly what happened. What the 3 marriages actually add up to. Look at the shape of it end to end. A penniless baron's daughter married a prime minister's alcoholic son at 18 and came out with a surname worth more than any dowry. She spent 14 years being financially supported by men she never married, refining exactly how much power a woman with no fortune could extract from relationships she didn't fully control. She married a Broadway producer and converted that decade and a half of informal arrangements into a formal, respectable, financially secure household. And she finished by marrying, for real, at last, the man from her own wartime past who happened to be one of the wealthiest and most politically connected Democrats in America, using that marriage to build a political machine that put her in a United States embassy for the final 4 years of her life. Every marriage moved her up a level she couldn't have reached from where she started. Every relationship in between the marriages was doing the same work on a smaller scale. Whether you read that as a woman using the only tools a mid-century patriarchy left available to a titled but broke Englishwoman, or as a coldly calculated 60-year project in social and financial engineering, probably depends on which parts of her story you weigh most heavily. Her supporters point to the diplomatic career and the political fundraising as proof there was substance behind the surname collecting. Her critics point to the trust fund lawsuit and the pattern of financially generous men appearing at every turn as proof the substance came later and the pattern came first. Consider, too, what she never had to do. She never built a company. She never wrote the biography publishers repeatedly tried to commission from her, the one that would have explained, in her own words, exactly how she saw the 60 years everyone else kept trying to narrate for her. She hired a ghostwriter for it once, in 1991, and then walked away from the project entirely, which left Christopher Ogden free to write his own unauthorized version instead. Reading between the lines of that decision, it's hard not to conclude she understood something about her own story that a lot of biographers missed. The ambiguity was doing more work for her reputation than a clear account ever could have. A woman who might have been driven purely by love, or purely by calculation, or some blend the world will never fully sort out, is a far more durable subject than one who settles the question herself. What's not really arguable is the scale of what she built. She started with a title and no money, and ended with money, a title, a political network, and an American embassy to her name. 3 marriages, and each one rewrote what she was worth, on paper and in the rooms that mattered. If this is the kind of story you want more of, The real history behind the name's history reduces to gossip, told with the actual research behind it instead of the recycled version. Subscribe now, and let us know in the comments which woman from this era you want covered next. We read every one of them, and more than a few of these episodes started exactly that way.